This video will be a review of the gameplay of Pathologic 2 and an explanation of why I think it's the game of the year for 2020. For reasons that will soon become obvious, any discussion of the gameplay of Pathologic must also involve its plot, but I want to avoid a story discussion as much as possible. Several great videos on this platform have dived very deep into the story of Pathologic, and I don't want to retread ground. Instead, any discussions of the story in this video will only be in the context of how they relate to the gameplay of Pathologic 2. Pathologic is a unique game, and dissecting it will require a unique approach. Every operation begins with an incision, so let's start with combat. After the dreamlike intro sequence, the player is immediately thrust into the unnamed town, which will be the setting of Pathologic 2 for the next 30 hours or so. The player takes the role of the Haruspex, Artemy Burak, the son of the only doctor in the town. 5 years after leaving the town to study medicine, Artemy received a disturbing letter from his father asking him to return. His homecoming is met with knives out as he is attacked after leaving the train. Artemy's father has been murdered, and the townsfolk suspect that he is the culprit. The player's goal is to find who murdered their father, and to survive a deadly plague which soon begins to wreak havoc on the town. The game begins with the player character hungry, tired, and at low health after killing his 3 attackers. For the first day of your stay in Pathologic, most of the town will hate you and attack on sight. This is where Pathologic teaches its first painful lesson. Combat is dangerous. Pathologic is a game about resource management under shifting and stressful conditions. Combat, like every other system in Pathologic, is fundamentally concerned with the expenditure of resources. In an ideal encounter, the player will take little to no damage and kill the enemy combatant quickly. This requires the use of a weapon. Going barehanded against an armed opponent will likely result in the loss of a substantial amount of health, or even death. With a bit of practice in a weapon, it's easy for the player to defeat any enemy one-on-one while taking minimal hits. However, each strike that lands on the opponent will damage your weapon of choice. As the weapon degrades, the damage it does decreases, and the resources required to repair it increase geometrically. It only takes 1 whetstone to repair a lightly damaged knife, but a fully damaged one requires 3 separate resources to repair to 1/3 of its durability, then 2 separate resources to repair it up to 2/3, and then finally 1 whetstone to finish the repair. The standard knife will only last about 6 kills before it's worn out. If you continue further beyond that without repairing it, it will be completely destroyed after a successful swing. This means that even successful combat encounters have serious consequences for the player. Fight absolutely everyone you can, and you'll find your weapons degrading too quickly to survive with that lifestyle. The most resource-efficient method of dealing with combat is to avoid it. By traveling uninhabited back streets, or spinning the fast travel resource toenails, it's possible to avoid encountering most foes. The poorly explained stealth mechanic also allows the player to skirt around hostile enemies at the expense of speed. At the start of the game, the player will be inexperienced at fighting and poorly equipped to deal with the numerous people attacking them from all sides, and so will be forced to avoid combat and keep to the outskirts. This costs them time, which quickly comes into focus as the most valuable resource in Pathologic 2. Pathologic operates on a pseudo-real-time system. Anytime the player is not in a pause menu or in dialogue, time is advancing. A full day in Pathologic takes about 2 hours, though as the game reaches its climax, this isn't always the case. As time goes by, the player character grows more hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. If they are not in an area infested with the plague, then they will gain immunity over time. If they are in a plague-infested area, then their immunity will decrease over time. Every day, different tasks will be available to the player, and new tasks will become available throughout the day without warning. Each of these tasks require the player to be at a specific location or set of locations before a specific time. Most tasks end at midnight, others at dawn, and a small few can end at other times. In one of the striking decisions which defines this game, Pathologic gives the player more tasks to do than are possible to accomplish. Now, as a caveat, this isn't technically true. On repeat playthroughs, adept players actually are capable of accomplishing every quest and saving every NPC from the plague. But on a first playthrough, the player will have no chance of saving every NPC and completing every quest. During each day of Pathologic 2, the player is required to plan out a route through the town to most efficiently accomplish the tasks they need and want to do, while regularly being interrupted with tasks which inevitably throw that plan into disarray. There are very few times during Pathologic when the player will have a chance to wander the town. Due to the time constriction and the bevy of tasks on the map, movement in Pathologic always has a purpose, whether it is to gather necessary resources or to speak to an interesting NPC. Crucially, this purpose is decided by the player. Player freedom is a selling point of many video games, especially RPGs. Many RPGs feature binary choices during the story, which have varying levels of impact on the overall narrative and gameplay. Pathologic has these as well. Many RPGs feature a variety of side quests, which offer the player various rewards. Pathologic also has a variety of optional tasks, though rewards can be hard to come by. What sets Pathologic apart is that all tasks are optional. The player can actually avoid the entire story if they choose to not pursue any map markers. Time continues to advance, and the situation becomes much worse without the player's involvement. Eventually, the game will end with the player having had no impact on the outcome of events. This is an edge case, but I think it shows a valuable point about the design of Pathologic 2. While the quest lines are often linear, which quest lines a player follows is left entirely up to them, even if that means letting the town fall to ruin and abdicating your role. The choice of which quest lines to pursue is made instantly more meaningful by the restriction of time. When pursuing all the quests is impossible, choosing which ones to follow permanently affects the game state and your perception of the narrative as you lose certain details. In Skyrim, you can join every guild, do every quest, and level up every skill with the same character. This has its advantages, but it renders the decision of which guild to join or which skill to level much less interesting. If the quest is always available, and you can always take the time to level up a skill, then there's no real reason to prioritize any quest besides personal preference. The decision lacks lasting consequences. Every gameplay action in Pathologic has permanent consequences for the game state, including which quest to pursue, and more importantly, which quest to not pursue. This gives the game a great tension as the player attempts to utilize their time and resources as efficiently as possible at every opportunity. There are lives on the line after all. Another key distinction between Pathologic and many RPGs is that almost every NPC is capable of dying. This doesn't mean the player can kill them, as named NPCs are immune to player attacks. Instead, the characters are vulnerable to the plague, which begins ravaging the town on day 3. When the plague infects a district, all named NPCs who live in that district have a chance to contract the plague at midnight. If given the proper drugs, this chance can be lowered to a worryingly small extent. If a character has the plague, then there is a chance they will die. Each day they survive without being cured increases the risk of death, until it becomes inevitable. Upon a character's death, none of the tasks or quests associated with that character will be presented to the player for the rest of the game. This gives drugs an inherent value to the player, and adds another optional set of tasks for them to pursue each day as they give their chosen characters medicine. Early on, the player is given a list of 8 names, 7 of which he knows belongs to children around the town. These 7 children are the Haruspexes Bound, who are given their own section on the character screen. It is stressed to the player that these 7 children are to be kept alive at all costs. In reality, the game will continue no matter how many of the Bound survive, but they are some of the most endearing characters in the game and have many associated interesting quests that the player misses out on should they perish. Similar to the daily tasks the player is presented with, it's very difficult to save all 7 children. To save every named NPC in the town is extremely difficult. This lends another layer of consequence to the player's actions. Medicine is often in limited supply, and the same drugs which boost an NPC's immunity to plague are needed by the player to survive in the infected districts. Taking the time to walk into an infected district and administer an immunity-boosting drug is an expense of both time and resources, which the player may not be able to spare. This means that efficient play with bartering and the survival mechanics will put the player in a better position to save NPCs and thus pursue the story. It also means that the player's choices during gameplay have a direct narrative impact on the story's progression. Because like all choices in Pathologic, who to save is a hard choice. A tagline from Pathologic 2's marketing was, "You can't save everyone." No matter what decisions you come to in a playthrough of Pathologic, they will always come at the cost of other choices you could have made. This quality is key to the sense of player freedom that Pathologic provides. If you are free to do everything, then all choices are equivalent, and that freedom becomes meaningless. If your choices are limited, the freedom to choose one path at the cost of another becomes an interesting decision which will have a permanent impact on the game. Following the task markers, most players will soon arrive at the shelter, home of Artemy's childhood friend, Lara Ravel, where they will be provided with food and a place to sleep. Food works as it does in many survival games. As time advances, the hunger meter depletes. When it reaches 0, the player will begin to take damage until they die or eat something. Different foods refill different amounts of the hunger bar, but these amounts are not revealed to the player before consuming the food item. After the player finishes eating, sleep is the next priority. Exhaustion works much the same way that food does. Over time, the exhaustion bar depletes, and when it hits 0, the player begins taking damage to their health until they sleep or die. Sleep is only permitted in specific beds, which are marked on the map, and instead of taking physical resources like eating does, it requires the investment of time. The player is allowed to select how long they will sleep for in 1-hour increments, with longer sleep sessions restoring more exhaustion. As the player sleeps, the hunger and thirst meters will decrease, just as they would if they were awake. This presents a fundamental tug-of-war between the exhaustion and hunger stats. Satisfying hunger requires going out into the town and spending time gathering the required food, either through barter, purchase, or a quest. After food is secured, it won't be long before the player has to sleep, which will absorb time which cannot be spent gathering food, thus eating at the player's stockpile. It quickly becomes apparent that Artemy's physical needs are almost comically exaggerated. In a normal day of Pathologic 2, Artemy will begin starving unless he eats roughly the equivalent of 1 whole fish, a large glass of milk, and 2 slices of meat pie. Less than 24 hours after eating all that, he will starve and die unless he eats more. Likewise, going more than 12 hours without a drink of water can be fatal to Artemy. There is a story explanation for this. It's emphasized by Laura as well as several other characters that the twire, the herbs that grow in the steppe, are in heavy bloom this September. The pollen from the twire clouds the air of the town, making it hard to breathe and causing various physiological ailments, the most pressing of which is that the player is required to eat, sleep, and drink more than what would be considered normal. The twire cloud exists as a conceit to gameplay in more ways than one. The primary motivation for this inclusion is that it makes food and water much more precious than they would be otherwise within the 11 days of the game. If the player didn't need more food and water than a normal human, they would only have to interface with the survival mechanics a few times earnestly over the course of those 11 days. If the game were made longer, then the value of time would decrease as its supply inflated. The limited amount of time available to the player is the beating heart which powers the rest of the game's systems and story. If the player was allowed to roam the game at their own pace, the entire structure would fall apart. With hunger, thirst, and exhaustion increasing so quickly, the player is forced to confront the scarcity of food, water, and time much more regularly. This leads to the player having to make more interesting and sometimes desperate decisions than they would have otherwise. The other gameplay benefit is for the frame rate. Pathologic 2 is not a particularly well-coded game, and sometimes it has performance issues even on PCs that should be able to run it well. The Twire Cloud limits the player's view distance, which is probably the only reason Pathologic 2 is able to perform as well as it does. The thick haze also gives the streets and steppe a particular ambiance. Seeing the polyhedron emerge through the twilight haze is particularly beautiful. As the player wanders the Twire clouded streets, they will be beset on all sides by various resources in the form of bins and townsfolk. A wide variety of items can be found semi-randomly distributed throughout the town in dumpsters and trash cans. While these items are of relatively low value to the player, many of them can be traded to NPCs for different items, which might be more useful. Most generic NPCs in a town can be bartered with, and this bartering system is key to the player's survival. Different groups of townsfolk carry different items and value items differently. For example, townsfolk women value bandages and tourniquets and will trade needles and thread for them. Teenage boys value sharp objects like fishhooks and razor blades and will trade food or drugs for them. Children are perhaps the most valuable of all NPCs, as they will trade food, drugs, and other supplies for nuts, raisins, or beetles. This system presents several interesting facets for the player to consider. First is location. Stepfolk live close to the factory and will have different items than townspeople who live near the bridge square, while children gather at playgrounds. This means to trade for or with specific items, the player will need to go to specific places. Second is time. At night, the streets empty out, and it will be much more difficult to find people to barter with on the street. If your reputation permits, you can go into people's houses to try to trade with them there. But this is more restrictive than trading during the day, as there are far less children to trade with indoors, and going into people's houses takes a bit more time.
Location also ties in with this.
Because everything in Pathologic takes time, the player may not be able to afford to travel across town to trade with a specific group of NPCs without giving up on some other priority. The final and most limiting aspect of trading is space. Pathologic 2 uses a very traditional grid-based inventory management system. The player's inventory consists of a number of rectangular compartments made of smaller square units. Each item takes up a certain number of squares in a particular arrangement, and it is up to the player to organize their inventory so that they can accommodate the various shapes and sizes of their items. Duplicate items stack, so one bottle of water and one empty bottle take twice the space of 10 full bottles. This allows the player to stockpile specific resources if they are able to acquire them, but prevents them from having a broad range of items on hand at all times. This serves as a natural cap for the player's ability to hoard. Even if a player is successful enough to fill their inventory with useful items, they are prevented from getting more until some of those items have been consumed, bartered away, or sold. Without a limited inventory space, the theft and bartering mechanics would be much easier to abuse, and after a point, the player would never have to worry about eating or repairing their weapons again. While the limited inventory can be frustrating, a larger inventory or a weight-based system would leave the player with less decisions to make and less variables to consider. With all of these mechanics introduced, Pathologic's gameplay follows a regular daily rhythm. At dawn, the player will be presented with a variety of tasks, with more trickling into the player throughout the day. They will need to maintain their health, hunger, thirst, exhaustion, reputation, and immunity at acceptable levels as they follow these tasks, eating, sleeping, drinking, and repairing their weapons and clothing. This can involve detour around a hostile area, a stop at a playground to barter with children, or a desperate search for a store that will sell you food. Most quests expire at midnight, so the player has until then to accomplish whatever they can. In addition to the marked tasks, the player will need to care for every NPC who is infected or at risk of being infected to give them a decent chance of survival. At midnight, some tasks expire, and the player is presented with the plague's toll for that day. Certain tasks only become available after midnight, such as the nightly theater performance, which presents the player with a surreal take on the next day's events and opens the useful dead item shop. These night tasks expire at dawn, however, keeping the player under time constraint. At dawn, the cycle begins again. It's almost certain that, during a first playthrough, there will come times when the player is pressed for food, water, drugs, and time. This can lead to desperate decisions. I don't know if I'll ever forget a particular moment in my first playthrough. I was starving, completely out of money, and completely out of barter materials. I was extremely nervous about dying again, and I found a piece of rotten food in a trash can. I stared at the food in my inventory, reading over the description. Knowing full well that it was a bad idea, I ate that food. Because I was that desperate to survive just another few minutes to perhaps find some way to feed myself. Predictably, the food restored a pitiful amount of hunger and decreased my immunity and health. The right decision to make would have been to take some damage from starvation and continue on to scrabble for food, which I did eventually find enough material to barter for. But Pathologic let me make that bad choice and put me in a place where I was desperate enough to disregard the long term in favor of what I perceived as my survival. This moment would not have stuck with me if it hadn't been for how Pathologic uses its death and save mechanics to enforce consequences on the player. Death is a universal human experience. We're all going to die one day. Each action, therefore, incurs an opportunity cost. You're watching a free YouTube video right now, but there is a cost that you are paying. Instead of watching this video, you could be watching another, or doing anything else. I'm not trying to convince you to leave, or that YouTube videos can be meaningful. No matter what action you choose, there will always be an infinite number of other actions you did not choose, and you will never be able to go back and take those other paths. Even if we were able to somehow rewind time and change our past decisions, most of our lives are completely out of our control, especially how they begin and end. Our place in the world is temporary, and our ability to affect it is limited by our circumstances and past decisions. Every action has consequences. The universal cost is time that will never be returned to us. Every art form has explored death, and games are no exception. Many arcade and roguelike games require the player to complete them in one life. If the player dies, they are returned to the start of the game, and it is as if they had never played at all. This can give a lot of weight to the player's decisions, as they risk losing anywhere from a few minutes to several hours of playtime upon losing a character. This approach wouldn't work for a longer experience, however. Losing 20 hours of progress and having to start over simply isn't viable for most people to do, even if there was an artistic gain to such a thing. As such, most long-form single-player games rely on a save system. In most single-player long-form games, when the player dies, they are returned to a menu where they can choose to reload from any of their saved games. As far as the story and gameplay are concerned, the death never happened, and the player is allowed to retry whatever challenge defeated them before. Especially in games that allow saving anywhere, this minimizes the punishment for death as much as possible. Despite this, death still is a punishment, because it usually forces the player to go through content they've already seen, which is generally less interesting than going through a new area, as it lacks novelty and a sense of accomplishment. This punishment is minimized in games that allow quick saving, where it is common for the player to save every few minutes or even seconds, depending on the level of challenge they're facing. If the player utilizes their quick save in Skyrim properly, they'll never be inconvenienced by more than a few minutes upon any individual death. The same applies to the original Pathologic, which heavily encouraged save scumming through its sometimes cheap combat encounters, more dangerous plague clouds, and frustrating rats. The constant threat of death evoked more frustration and tedium than genuine fear. Poor play in the original game was unlikely to result in you being unable to continue. Instead, it would merely extend your playtime by hours as you reloaded mistakes over and over, pushing through the game with brute force. This certainly lent the game its own atmosphere, but Pathologic 2, in a truly brilliant move, decided to eschew the quick save system, which was already almost universal in single-player PC games when the original game released in 2005. Saving in Pathologic 2 is only allowed at specific clocks marked on the map. Save points were originally a concession to hardware limitations. However, there are a number of modern games which still make use of this feature. This decision inherently lends more weight to dangerous situations, as the player risks more time spent replaying the game from their last save. However, Pathologic 2's true innovation lies in its punishments. Every time the player dies in Pathologic 2, they are transported to a theater of death, where they are confronted by Mark Immortel, the town's theater director. Throughout Pathologic, there is the overarching theme of a play, with the player being an actor taking on Artemy Brock's role. When the player dies, a new actor replaces the previous one. However, the task before them becomes more difficult. Every time the player dies, some permanent punishment is exacted upon them. This usually involves losing max health, but there are other gameplay and story ramifications of repeatedly dying. This is made excruciatingly clear to the player, as their health bar will now always have an orange chunk at the right, which will never be able to be filled. It doesn't matter how far back you reload, that save file will permanently record deaths that happened in it, and the consequences will always remain. This mechanic makes death much more painful for the player. Not only do you lose the time you spent since last saving, but you now also have to deal with a permanent decrease to your max health. But why make a system which permanently punishes failure by making it easier to fail again? This idea goes against almost every modern design principle, but I think it is the mechanic which makes Pathologic 2 an absolutely engrossing experience to play. Death is a universal human experience. We're all going to die one day. Despite this, almost everyone wants to avoid dying for as long as possible. We all know it's coming, we just prefer it to be later. Faced with death, people become capable of amazing acts of strength, speed, quick thinking, and even compassion. As social animals, human survival instinct can extend to other people. In desperate situations, people are capable of incredible acts of ingenuity, grit, and resolve, motivated by their desire to keep living or to keep someone else alive. A wolf will chew its own paw off to escape a trap. A mother can lift a car to save her child. I have only played one game which has evoked both the absolute low of destroying part of yourself to survive, as well as the exhilarating adrenaline rush of saving someone else's life. Because time and resources are so precious in Pathologic 2, death is never more than a day away and is often much closer. The same resources that keep the player alive are needed to save the various NPCs they have been tasked with protecting. If an NPC dies, then they are gone forever. No quest lines featuring them will appear from then on, and whatever secrets they held are forever lost. This encourages the player to disregard their own survival and play towards keeping as many characters as possible alive, as the story is one of the main motivating factors for continuing the game. However, the player is also incentivized by the death mechanic to survive at all costs. Any death will make all play from that point forward more difficult. In many games, it's common to reload again and again to deal with a difficult encounter, but trying the same failing tactic over and over in Pathologic will result in permanent consequences for the player. The tension that lies between saving yourself and saving an NPC that you've grown to love lies at the heart of Pathologic 2. This tension would not exist if the player wasn't punished when they died, and if they were allowed to save whenever they wanted to. Giving a child medicine early in the day can be almost deafening in consequence. You aren't sure exactly what tasks that they will bring or what resources you'll find. You only have a limited supply of medicine to provide for yourself and whoever you decide to share it with. It may well be that you find yourself in desperate need of that medicine later that night at 10 o'clock, and not having it prevents you from accomplishing some task or giving medicine to someone else. If you die at 10 o'clock, recklessly pursuing your lofty ideal of saving every person in town, you will only find a more difficult task laid before you when reloading. After dying 2 or 3 times attempting the same route, most players will be forced to give up and change their plans, compromising their vision of success. As the days go by, the rules of the game are shifted and warped in order to prevent the player from finding steady ground. Particularly notable is when the Inquisitor arrives to town on day 7 and takes over the local food supply. From that point onward, food can only be bought in stores with state-provided ration cards. Similar events are sprinkled throughout the game, in enough numbers such that the player never feels too safe in their expectations. The rules and heuristics that apply early on in the game may not apply later. The gameplay of Pathologic 2 remains engaging and interesting right up until the end, and has a relatively consistent difficulty curve. While the game's brutal opening certainly sets the tone, it isn't as dangerous as it first appears. Being reduced to 0 health only results in you getting knocked out on day 1. The player soon learns that avoiding citizens isn't that hard when you put your mind to it, and simply waiting will eventually clear your reputation. The first several days, resources are plentiful and prices are relatively low. By the end of the game, the mechanics have sharpened to such an extent that it feels like the world of the game itself has turned against you. As the game hurtles towards its incredible conclusion, there is a one-of-a-kind mix of desperation, fear, uncertainty, and hope that makes Pathologic 2 one of the most intense and memorable gameplay experiences I've ever had. That's why it's my game of the year for 2019. It's odd how well the ideas of Pathologic 2, a game released early in 2019, parallel things that have become mainstream discussion points in 2020. Of course, Pathologic 2 features the outbreak of a disease and the forced quarantine of people, though thankfully our real-world virus is much more forgiving than the Sandpest's 100% fatality rate. But the experience of playing Pathologic 2 actually mirrors certain elements of life in a pandemic. As normal life collapses around them, the player is left destitute of resources and must make tough decisions in order to survive. The player will need to seek out information from figures of authority, but receives conflicting information and direction. The existing authority figures are completely incompetent in dealing with the outbreak, but the ones in Pathologic are much more likable than their real-world counterparts. As the player has no prior knowledge of how to behave in the situation, they are forced to rely on their own judgment. A lot of people die. Inevitably, the trajectory of the town's future will be irrevocably altered. While the world of Pathologic is undeniably alien, there is something familiar in these sensations. More than any other game I played, Pathologic 2 feels like playing 2020. What I've just described may sound horrible. If we already have to deal with the horrors of disease in the real world, why would we seek them out in a game? For me, the answer is agency. In Pathologic 2, the player is put into a position of relative power. If they play well, it's possible to save many more lives and explore all the nooks and crannies of the town. Ultimately, the fate of the town rests in the player's hands. And while the player is limited by the mechanics and what decisions they can make, those decisions always have an impact. While you may not know which action to take, the one you take matters and will have a tangible outcome on the world and your character. In real life, things are rarely so obvious. Most of us have little control over our environment, especially now. Experiencing the agency in Pathologic 2 can be just as exhilarating as it is stressful, and that exhilaration couldn't exist without the stress. While Pathologic is a game about desperation and survival, it is also a game about helping those who cannot help themselves, about healing people, and about the compassion and hope that drive us in dark times. By pushing the player to the absolute limit, but always leaving outcomes in the player's hands, Pathologic provokes the player into displaying their best and their worst qualities. I'll never forget the first time I stole from a house in Pathologic 2. I'll never forget leaving Ruben to die to the worms because I couldn't survive the fight. I'll never forget racing across town to give Murky my last medicine instead of the other children who were in my care, and instead of taking it for myself, leading to my own infection. While the original game was conceived of as a play before being adapted into a video game, Pathologic 2 doesn't seem like it could be anything but a game. It seemingly effortlessly ties together aspects of survival, RPG, and horror games with its own unique outlook on player agency to create an experience that is absolutely one of a kind, completely total in its vision, and expertly tuned to force the player to engage in its mindset. Watching a Let's Play of Pathologic 2 conveys almost nothing of the actual experience of playing it. It's a game which must be experienced to be understood, and not just on a gameplay level. The ideas and emotions which lie at the core of Pathologic 2's narrative are forced upon the player through the act of playing. The story lies just as much in digging through trash cans for bottles as it does in the written dialogue. Pathologic 2 stands as one of the landmark games of our time, even though its achievements have been muffled by a lackluster critical reception. With its unique artistic vision, it captured the zeitgeist of a year which hadn't happened yet, by perfectly aligning its bizarre, heartfelt story and innovative mechanics. For all these reasons, Pathologic 2 stands as my pick for Game of the Year 2020 and my favorite game of all time.